So what are the best three or the top three reasons to believe that Jesus actually physically rose from the dead? I'm talking today with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, who recently wrote a book entitled Body of Proof. Let me actually make myself full screen one more time so you guys can see this. It's called Body of Proof, a very, very new book. Just came out by Jeremiah J. Johnston. He is a New Testament scholar. He ministers internationally as president of Christian Thinkers Society. But the subtitle here, The 7 Best Reasons to Believe in the Resurrection of Jesus and Why It Matters Today. So what I've chosen to do for this stream is, instead of discuss all of the 7 different reasons, I'm going to let you guys go and actually read the book yourself if you want everything. But what we're going to do is limit ourselves today as best we can to the top 3 reasons that you would pick of these 7. And I don't even know, like, you haven't told me these 3 reasons. So maybe you're even pulling from stuff outside of the book. I don't know. But, well, Jeremiah, it's great to have you on Capturing Christianity. I can't believe this is your first time on the show.
Cameron, I can't either. I've been waiting for my invite, and I feel so cool. I'm finally joining you. And listen, I got to brag about you for a second. I have had the privilege of knowing Cameron and his amazing wife, Brittany, I guess since 2015. And Cameron, you had a vision. You chased after the vision God gave you, and I salute you, my friend, seriously, because what I heard the vision in a family room of one of your relatives early on, that you wanted to have intellectual conversations about the faith with both people who believed and people who don't, and have helpful conversations. And you've modeled for us how to have healthy faith conversations, and you've done it with just ease, effectiveness. You've also done it with excellence. So I love watching your channel, and I'm more than anything, I'm just excited about how God's using you and the journey you've been on, and I just love it, man. I'm cheering for you. I'm just so excited about what you're doing and what more you're going to do in light of everything that's happening.
I so appreciate that. I mean, I remember, I'm trying to remember the exact year that we first met, and I invited you to come speak at our church at the time, and you came, and I think I was like moderating, or I was taking questions from the audience, and then you were answering them, and then you also spoke, I think, on Sunday morning, and then maybe later on we went and had lunch at my in-laws, and the food that they make is just ridiculously good. You probably
I've never
remember
forgotten that meal. It was a true Sunday lunch.
I'm telling you, their food is amazing. It's amazing.
And then
we're always looking for.
That was a minute ago, because you then took me in this room because you're so gifted, and you're like, hey, let me take this photograph of you really quick. And I mean, like, I didn't dress up, I just had whatever I had on that day, which I dressed pretty cool, but I had whatever I had. I didn't know we were going to do a photo shoot. And then you took the coolest photo of me. And I ended up using that in my Unimaginable book as like the headshot that went in the book. And that book has really been blessed. So yeah, you're just multi-gifted, man. Multi-gifted.
I'm actually looking to see if I can pull it up. I'd probably have to go on my Facebook page to pull up the photo. It was a photo I was actually really proud of. I want to eventually turn these photos that I've taken of these different apologists, put it into like a coffee table book, and just let people check out who these different Christian apologists are and a little about their work. And I need to pick that project back up. There's too many things to do in apologetics.
I know, and I'll tell you why I'm excited about that project is one thing I've always criticized about the Reformation. For all the good, we really lost track with our Christian heroes of the past. It's something the Catholic Church has done so well, but most evangelical Christians can't tell you anything about Christians outside of the New Testament for the last 2,000 years. And so the opportunity to celebrate the good work of God in people like a coffee table of modern apologists, coffee table book. I mean, I love that, because I would love to sit down and with my 5 children and explain who these people are and the great contributions they've made.
Well, Jeremiah, let's get to the book today, which is, I love all of the artwork that you have. I assume that you're not the one that's actually designing these covers, unless you've got these hidden talent, graphic design skills that I'm just unaware of.
No, definitely no skill there at all. Know enough to be dangerous, but no, I did give that. We have some great artists that have worked on our book cover at Baker Publishing, and they get all the credit. But I will tell you, I wanted the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I wanted the light. That was my only contribution.
Well, so tell me, how should we begin looking at these three different reasons? I want to get to them as quickly as possible and then turn to some Q&A with the audience. That's typically what we do here. I'll talk with the guest maybe 30, 45 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A with the audience. I love to be able to give the audience an opportunity to push back and ask their questions.
Please.
And like you said, we have skeptics that watch the show. We have a lot of Christians that watch the show, but it's just a really good opportunity to kind of just learn some things and learn a different perspective. So getting into what would be your number one reason? I don't know if you've the way that you've sort of formulated these, if you're going to give like the strongest reasons first or last, or how are you going to do this? But just tell me the first one. What is a good reason to believe that Jesus actually rose physically from the dead?
Now, I want to clarify your question, if you don't mind, Cameron. Are you talking about the one that I think is the best, or the one that like I would share with people that didn't know anything about the resurrection? Like, what would you prefer?
Yeah, I'm probably thinking more about the first, the former. So, like, what is in your mind the strongest reason?
I'm glad you said that. And so I set this book up kind of like a video game, like, easy, normal, hard, where you select the level of difficulty. You can really finish the book before part 4. But at part 4, it gets super exciting because part 4 is what I call New Frontiers and resurrection research related to Jesus. Meaning, I'm hoping people are going to watch this program and they might engage with the final 2 chapters of my book and say, hey, I'm going to go do a PhD on one of those 2 subjects. Because if I were to go back, Cameron, rewind the clock, go back to Oxford 2009, move there, not know a soul, this would be a book. I'd be like, okay, I think I could build a research question on one of those 2 interesting arguments. And the first one is this, and let me see how I say it in the book. And the Jesus's bodily resurrection was not what any of his disciples expected or anticipated, because they didn't expect the Messiah to die. This is made very clear in 4Q 285, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is the Essene community, of course, of late antiquity, this would be the Dead Sea Scroll Qumran community. They make the point, Cameron, that they expected, their messianic hopes were that the Messiah, should he appear, would kill the Kittim. That was code for the Roman Empire, and specifically the Roman occupiers and the Roman emperor himself. So they were expecting a conquering king. Certainly no one was expecting a Messiah to die. And so that leads right into my point. And this is an original contribution of this book. I preceded it by publishing it in a textbook on the philosophy of religion in a chapter 16 called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. I give the academic side there. This is more of a popular treatment, but there's no motivation psychologically. Here's the point. No motivation psychologically for the early Jewish followers of Jesus to invent a resurrection narrative. Judaism is a coherent religion. Early Jews, and for that matter, all Jews, believed in a future eschatological resurrection. I think of the famous Rabbi Akiba of the early 2nd century, one of the great contributors of the Mishnah. He had a great following like Jesus. He had male and female followers. He was great. Nobody made up a resurrection narrative about him. They didn't need to. And so if you and I, Cameron, were trying to invent a false narrative, not a true one, but one that we thought, would take hold, we would never make up. We wouldn't have any psychological motivation to say, hey, Jesus died and he rose again from the grave. We could honor him as a great teacher because of the coherence of Judaism, believing that in a general eschatological resurrection, we could even see that Jesus would rise from the dead someday with all Israel. We wouldn't need to. There's no psychological motivation to make up a resurrection narrative because of the coherence of our religion, unless it actually happened. So that's the quickie treatment on it. I think that's a really exciting, what psychological motivation is there if you're a Jew, which all the first Christians were Jews, to make up this narrative if you didn't need it? And we see other examples of that. After all, Cameron, there are 28 different Jewish men who have claimed to be the Messiah. 28 different messianic contenders. I get into some of the messianic contenders or pretenders in Body of Proof as well, where I talk about some of the features. We even hear about some of these in the historical documents that make up the New Testament. Acts chapter 5, Gamaliel, who brings up two of them when he makes that interesting statement about the early nascent Christian movement, that if this is of man, it'll fail like the others, like that guy who took the Egyptians, the 4,000 Egyptians out into the wilderness, or he names these different messianic movements. But he said if it's of God, we'll be fighting against God. We won't be able to stop it. And so leaning into this, I would love to see some students take up this call and say, what psychological motivation exists to invent a resurrection narrative? Because they sure didn't for Rabbi Akiba. Why make it up for Jesus?
So first thing I need to do is ask you why your setup looks so good. Most of the people that I interview on YouTube, they're not in like a nice TV setup. You know, they're like in their office somewhere. They're using a webcam. Why does your background and why does it look like you're in a TV studio right now?
Well, Cameron, because I was coming on with you, I had to up my game, man. I had to like shower for this and put on cologne. I mean, seriously, no, we do. I'm blessed. I'm on the team here at Prestonwood Baptist Church, Prestonwood Christian Academy, and of course still doing Christian Thinkers Society. And the amazing thing about being here is I have access to people that are like you, super creative, super into apologetics and spreading the word on media. And we do want to do it with excellence. That's why your channel is so popular, is you do it so well. It's easy to watch. We want to eliminate those barriers. So these amazing people I work with allow me just to walk in and be focused and prayerful about our conversation. So I'm not sitting here setting stuff up, which is a nice difference for me.
Well, okay, so to your reason that basically there was no psychological motivation that we can point to that explains the sort of genesis of the belief in resurrection. So a little bit of pushback on that might be there's a really popular in the atheist skeptical community, especially those that focus on the Bible. So there's just like kind of with apologists, there's apologists who focus on like defending like biblical apologetics, and then there's others that more like what I kind of do is more like on the philosophy side of things. So we'll defend the different arguments for God's existence. We'll discuss the problem of evil. Atheists, the atheists kind of fall along those same lines. Like some of them are really interested in like debunking the biblical narratives. Then there's others who are more philosophical. They like to pose different challenges to different theistic arguments. But where I'm kind of going with this is that the ones, the atheists who do focus on the Bible seem to have, and maybe this is true beyond just like online atheist skeptics, YouTubers, but there seems to be at least a sort of coherent alternative hypothesis that's being offered called the bereavement hallucination hypothesis, where it's not necessarily like a theological motivation that the first disciples would have had to invent a resurrection narrative, but more like something like they were missing this person that they grew to know and to love over the course of, a few years of however long the ministry was. And then suddenly he was taken away from them. And there are some examples in the psychological literature about people hallucinating their loved ones, after they died, they hallucinated them coming back. And there are certain psychological motivations for that happening. And so maybe the pushback is this: maybe there isn't like a theological motivator that's going to create this sort of resurrection, but maybe there's a more of like a mental, psychological, something that happened. So what is your response to that?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for asking such phenomenal questions first. This is fun to do an interview where I don't have to go on mental autopilot. So Garrett Ludemann made this argument famous, and he died. It's interesting. A lot of these naturalistic theory proponents have died in the last couple of years, Cameron, for what it's worth. So Garrett Ludemann made this hallucination theory, and I talk about it in the book, by the way, because the first thing I want to equip people with is something I learned in my doctoral residency, is we always want to share the case against, and we want to try to do it as clearly as we can so we can have a good conversation like you and I are having right now. And so I talk about this in my book, The Case Against the Resurrection of Jesus. But Garrett Ludemann said this, and he died, as I mentioned, in 2021. It may be taken as, listen to this, historically certain. Now, this is fascinating for a German scholar to say something is historically certain. I don't know if I've ever said anything is historically certain, because I have a thing about certainty. But it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus's death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So Garrett Ludemann is not contradicting the narrative that we have in the historical documents, being whether it be the letters of Paul or the Gospels or any of the other sources that we have for Jesus, 11 within the first 100 years after he lived. But what he is taking exception with, he made this whole hallucination theory very popular, that the early followers of Jesus, and perhaps not, as Cameron rightly pointed, for theological reasons, but just for being bereaved, had these experiences of wishing, almost wish fulfillment, wanting to be with Jesus. So, hey, I felt him, I experienced him, I saw him. The problem is very few people actually hold to this view today. I draw that out in the book. Very few actually hold to this view because it doesn't explain the conversion of hostile witnesses to Christianity who would not have wanted or had any motivation to hallucinate these things. I think specifically of James, who died in AD 62, not only believing his brother was the Son of God, but dying for it. And why do I know it's AD 62? Because Flavius Josephus tells us he died by stoning, believing his brother. And I mean, I asked an audience on Sunday, what would it take for you to believe your brother was the Son of God? I have 4 boys, and I can tell you none of them think the other one is the Son of God. So to die for that, to be stoned for that, and to have a historian like Josephus capture that. Same with the Apostle Paul, and I take a lot of time. Paul did not like all of humanity. He was what I call a misanthropic person. He didn't care for a lot of people. He was taught that. He had a PhD in Pharisaical Judaism. And so, he certainly had an issue with women. Better to burn the Torah than teach it to a woman. He would have agreed right on with Rabbi Judah in that sentiment. So the mass hallucination, or whatever derivative you take, and it was an original contribution. I mean, it certainly was an option that he threw out there, Garrett Ludemann. It just doesn't explain the conversion of those that doubted Jesus and those that were out and out hostile to them. We often forget that Paul, about a year or two after the crucifixion, depending on where you date it, had an experience of seeing Jesus physically resurrected. It even had physical implication on his eyesight. No one questions that. And so much so that he utterly transforms the world with Galatians 3:28. The fact that Paul is able to go from a misanthropic, theological, Jewish first, Jewish only person to there's neither Jew nor Gentile, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, we're all one in Christ Jesus. That really is where the argument, I think, falls flat for mass hallucination, because it just simply doesn't explain the conversion of the hostile and those that doubted. Those were out and out skeptics who wouldn't have hallucinated anything or wanted to about Jesus. They would have been happy Jesus was dead.
I think that's a good point. The hostile witnesses, like that the bereavement hypothesis doesn't explain these hostile witnesses to the Christian faith. Well, what about something I think a lot about is that for someone that does have a hallucination, it's very unlikely that person will then go on and continue to believe that this same person has actually come back from the dead, right? Most of us,
right.
If you've experienced some like what you think is a hallucination, I mean, even when you have migraines, like you can see spots and everything, it's not as if you see those spots and think, oh yeah, those spots actually exist in the physical universe, right? You can kind of recognize that, okay, your brain is playing a trick on you. This person is not actually there. And these people living in the first century weren't idiots. They could recognize when they were hallucinating. And so it doesn't explain, like, just because someone has a hallucination, even if that were to be the case, even if certain people did have hallucinations, then it doesn't explain why they would continue to go on and then be willing to die for a hallucination. So that's one point. Another point that often gets brought up is that it doesn't explain the sort of group hallucinations that are depicted in the Gospels.
Right.
You have these different groups of people that at the same time experience the risen Jesus, and a bereavement hypothesis, or the bereavement hallucination hypothesis, doesn't explain these sort of group appearances. So that's a lot trickier to deal with. Any thoughts on that before we move to your second reason?
I love this kind of conversation. I think that you're exactly right. And then when you draw it out even further, the fact that the nascent Christian community was able to change the complete paradigms of the Roman Empire as it relates to the treatment of women and children, healthcare, education. There's a letter 50 years before Jesus is born called Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 744. It's a love letter, again, about 50 years before the birth of Christ. And it sounds like this, Cameron, in Greek. It's a beautiful letter, other than when he gets to the point that his wife will give birth to their child before he returns. And he said, "Eon ain't they leia ekbale." If it's a girl, or if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, ekbale, throw it out, throw it in the trash can. And the fact that the resurrection of Jesus motivated Christianity to do something about infanticide, specifically child exposure, specifically with females who were at a great disadvantage, especially with widows, we see that there was a movement of ethics that even when you draw it out past believing if this actually happened in the real world, how then do you explain the incredible motivation in the face of all odds to spread this message that would have, it's so hard for us to even appreciate how tone deaf the message of Christianity would be on a first century audience. Every part of it was offensive to the Roman mind. And I think because of our historical distance, and Cameron, again, this is why I love your channel, because of our historical distance, we don't read the Bible with first century eyes. We import our own understanding, and we're anachronistic in that we import our own understanding on the text rather than just getting into the world of Jesus and Judaica in the first century and truly understanding what it was like then. And wow, that's where it becomes even more compelling, beyond just thinking they were still alive, to then go on and come against these terrible paradigms of the treatment of just children and women. No other group does that except the Christian movement, the way that believes Jesus rose from the grave. So it's just very compelling to me. I mean, they have to come up with a new term for burial. A lot of people don't realize the body dumping was a huge thing in Rome in the first century. If you had a slave and your slave died, just kick him to the curb, get another one. Remember, the number one slave market of the world was in the city of Ephesus, which was the second largest city in the Roman Empire. And so what do we see with the Christian movement? Christian movement, even with slaves, a part of our movement, they began caring for the body even in death. And they had to come up with a new burial term. There was sepulcher, mausoleum, or monumentum. But the early church started being buried together, koimao in Greek. Remember, we're just sleeping. That's an interesting thing to talk about, those that die in Christ. But they come up with a new burial term. It's koimaterion in Greek. It's the word we literally get. You can almost hear it, koimaterion, cemetery. So cemetery, every time you drive by one, make sure you know that the early Christian movement invented that word for burial. It means dormitories or sleeping rooms. The Christian movement even took care of dead bodies of slaves when body dumping was just kind of socially acceptable. So, I could give all these derivatives, but it really does. I think we've done a good job explaining how it just doesn't really work out in real life to say it was a mass hallucination. And that's where it gets, again, back to what is the motivation here? And I would love to see a PhD in a cross-disciplinary PhD in psychology and theology, or psychology and exegetical studies, to really look into this psychological motivation. I really think we're onto something. I think that's hopefully a contribution of this book, which is standing on the shoulders of other people that you know really well, Cameron, like Gary Habermas and Bill Craig. And but I'd love to see someone take that study up beyond just 2 chapters that I have.
Do you mind if I give one more pushback? It's not necessarily even a pushback. It's more.
It's a great conversation.
It's more like I can see skeptics hearing something like this and being like, okay, well, there are lots of things in the world that are just sort of unexpected. Like, we wouldn't expect this human to create whatever they created. Okay, that happens all the time. Like an example that just kind of came to the top of my head was J.R.R. Tolkien. Like, he created the Lord of the Rings. That's really unexpected. Like, no one, prior to writing that, no one would have expected him to create this beautiful, magical world of Middle Earth, right? But it doesn't follow from that Middle Earth is like this real place with real creatures and like a different universe, and it doesn't follow that any of it is true. Maybe to sort of tie it into something more historical, like when it comes to Islam, like Christians don't believe that Islam is true. Who would expect the Muslims to create what they created? So maybe what the skeptic could do is say, well, these people do create weird, unexpected things, even if they lacked a sort of motivation to do that. It's unexpected, sure, but is it as unexpected for them to create that as it would be for a miracle, a literal miracle, to happen? Like, what would be more likely? It seems more likely because we know that humans are creative and they make up weird things. Like, it just seems more likely, even if it's unexpected, like it still seems more likely than a miracle.
Right. And this is why the arguments build on each other, which is a great segue, if you don't mind, to my second reason. I want to answer your question, but I can't answer your question without bringing up my second line of argument. May I do that? Do I have your permission to do
perfect.
that? So if the gospel writers wanted to invent a resurrection narrative, let's say they were motivated, okay? Let's say it's all just a fake, it's a farce, and Cameron, you and I got together that first Easter weekend, and we've decided to hatch a plot and invent a religion. We're motivated to do that. Who knows why? We're morons. We're going to invent a religion. We're super creative guys. We're going to just come up with all the best details we can and try to be marketing aces. So let me just pause right there. So back in time in 2012, I was invited by Bill Craig to give a paper that was going to be reviewed at an academic conference at SBL, EPS at SBL Chicago 2012. And he said, Jeremiah, this section is New Testament confirmations, external confirmations of New Testament history. I was a junior faculty member at Acadia Divinity College at the time, lecturer in biblical studies. And Cameron, I write about this in the book. It's rather hilarious because I was the only non-Craig to present that day. Like, I was the only guy, the only dude that didn't have Craig in my name. It was Bill Craig, Craig Keener, Craig Blomberg, Craig Evans, Craig Hazen, I kid you not, and then me. So I stuck out like a sore thumb on this panel in more ways than one. And I gave a paper. I read a fascinating article by a scholar named Russ Dudry, and I took his line of argument. I'm a specialist in second century Christianity, what some pejoratively call the apocryphal gospels. I call the extra-canonical gospels. That's my real area of academic specialty. And I used the extra-canonical gospels to show examples of ways in which you would invent a story of Jesus that was not factual, but it was a good story that might catch on with people. And in doing so, I have a chapter in my book, Body of Proof. If the disciples invented the story of Jesus' resurrection, they did a terrible job. So back to my other story. So I gave this at a conference. Craig Keener met with me afterwards. Of course, I was so nervous to meet him. And he's such a great classicist and scholar. And he said, Jeremiah, you're really onto something with this argument. Keep studying, keep me informed. And again, that was more than 10 years ago now. And I'm excited that he endorsed my book and remembering those early days in my life and my quest after I got my PhD. And what's fascinating to me, Cameron, is if you and I were motivated to invent a religion, we would not invent it with the details that the gospel writers use. Let me give some examples. Number one, we cannot appreciate how heinous and shameful death by Roman crucifixion was. And so when we go back to those 28 messianic claimants that I mentioned in the first question, we would not expect any of those to be our Messiah if they died by crucifixion. Think of like the most offensive thing in your mind right now. Think of like an abuser or a pedophile, and then claiming that that person was some kind of messianic figure. That's almost like what telling someone in the Roman Empire our Messiah died on a cross. That's how they would interpret that. Like, ew, really? Seriously? I can't hear you more than that. In fact, it's evident that the most detailed description that we have of crucifixion from antiquity, a lot of people may not realize this, are the four Gospels. Crucifixion was such a heinous, shameful way to die that the Roman historians didn't even describe it in detail. It was left to the gospel writers to do that because it was such a disgusting, gross way to die. So You and I would not make a big deal about crucifixion. Secondly, if you and I were motivated to hatch a plot, we certainly wouldn't make it that Jesus physically came back from the dead, Cameron, because you and I would be so influenced by Socrates and the Platonic notion of the immortality of the soul. That, the body was evil. We had to get rid of this body. You and I need to become stars, like Socrates said, or we need to be immortal souls. The body is something to throw off. And no one, and I think Tom Wright has done a great job in his 2013 book, or 2003 book rather, The Resurrection of the Son of God, to explain how nobody outside of Judaism and nascent Christianity would even ascribe to any kind of belief in the resurrection. Not the mystery religions, none of it comes close. So that's the second odd detail. Again, if you and I were trying to come up with a marketable story, but not necessarily a true one. And then there's other things. I mean, we would not have females as the first witnesses. We would not. There's so many other lines that are embarrassing neat details. We wouldn't have cussing Christians, at the crucifixion weekend. We wouldn't have our lead disciple who occasionally spoke for Satan, like he does in Matthew 16, telling Jesus not to go to the cross when Jesus has to say, "Get away from me, Satan," and then claim him to be the lead disciple. There's a lot of odd, embarrassing narratives that make it, to me, smack of authenticity rather than a hatched up plan, even if you and I were motivated to bring up a story. Let's say we were by false motives or by impure ones, we wouldn't make it up this way. And then that says I show, because my area of specialty is second century, wow, the second century gospels are much different. Those are some exciting stories about Jesus, but not historical ones.
Yeah, so even
Long
if we
answer
did
for
have...
you.
Yeah, no. You're saying that even if there was some motivation to create some religion, it wouldn't be this one. It'd be a different story. One that is more believable, one that is better put together, one that is more coherent and doesn't include these sort of unnecessary, embarrassing details.
Right. And again, the Christianity's closest competitor in the first century was the cult of Mithra. And remember, that was a male-dominated cult. Women were not allowed. So you and I probably would have said, if we want to get a lot of followers, we probably shouldn't let women in this belief system. And yet, Rodney Stark told me this when I met with him, and God rest his soul. He made it clear in his works, I'm just standing on his shoulders, by AD 80, the early church is like 64% female. And so you can see why the church might have grown so fast in the face of the culture that, wow, this was a religion that was open to all classes, including slaves, and females were allowed.
So this kind of helped me out with this, because my initial question in response to your first one was the skeptic could just say, okay, even if it's unlikely, like it's not as unlikely as a miracle, like an actual miracle that Jesus rose from the dead, that is still more unlikely than someone creating this story. And so what we've done in this kind of second one is layer on the improbability of the specific narrative that we find in the New Testament. So the specific narrative that includes all these embarrassing details, that is even more unlikely for someone to create, especially if they're trying to convince others to join their religion. And so, but I think that the original skeptics' concern would still apply. They would still say, okay, even if it is even now more improbable that they would create this specific narrative, it's nevertheless not as improbable as a miracle.
Yeah, I mean, wise men choose probabilities, so I guess there's always a probabilistic issue. What I would say as a historian is the second century Christians seem to be aware that this is a problem. Back to my paper on external confirmations, when you look at the criticisms that Christianity opens itself up to, and these would be critics like that of Porphyry or Celsus. These are early 3rd and 4th century critics, Celsus and Porphyry. They seem to have the same problem. Like, you're expecting me to believe this. Why didn't your Messiah appear to Pontius Pilate? Why didn't your Messiah appear to the Jewish high priest? Come on, you have him appearing to women. What do the second century and beyond Gospels? I'm an expert in the Achman fragment, which is P. Cairo 10759, the accession number. They have a giant Jesus. They have polymorphic Christology. Jesus comes out of the tomb. He's humongous. It's like something out of the Avengers. The cross follows him out of the tomb, oddly enough, and the cross actually talks. The angels are huge, but Jesus is even bigger physically. And who does Jesus appear to in the second century Gospel of Peter? Well, he appears to Pontius Pilate, who proclaims him Lord and God. He appears before the Jewish high priests. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the second century as well. You know that from the 3 Jewish revolts. And so we see that there's some backfilling. Again, none of this is historical, but we do see, I think, that the early Christian movement, they realized the canonical Gospels were open to attack and questioning based on some of these embarrassing details. And maybe to increase the probability, they come alongside and essentially create these early Christian comics. Again, not historical at all, but they were important to certain communities. So it's a fascinating thing to think about when you compare the two.
Mm. So people still in that day were skeptical. And I mean, yeah, what I think about, I mean, I just interviewed recently Craig Keener, and we're still working on putting that interview together and polishing it and putting it on the channel. We talked about the recent revival in Asbury. He's as cool. You know, a professor at Asbury Theological Seminary. So what I think about when I think about this particular objection, like, okay, it's still more unlikely that we had a miracle occur. I just think about all of the work that has currently been done on miracles. Like, you can't just say, or as a matter of fact, or as a sort, you can assert anything that you want, I suppose. But it's a lot more difficult to actually support the claim that miracles don't happen, or there's no evidence for miracles. There's actually a whole lot of evidence for miracles, even today. And I just recently interviewed a guy. Now his name is completely escaping me. It's going to annoy me that I can't think of his name. But he worked with Craig Keener. Recently, he appeared on Unbelievable with Justin Brierly. And anyway, I can't remember his name. If you look in the archive of videos, you'll be able to find it really quickly. But it's like some very recent contemporary miracles. He's doing all of these different studies with this organization. And so I guess the point is that if this is your argument, then you've got to do a little bit more work than that. You can't just assert that miracles never happen, or that they're more improbable. It's a lot more difficult to actually argue that and come to that conclusion. Any thoughts on that 100%. Before we move to your third one?
Yeah, what I would like to say about that is, if you trace, so part of getting a PhD is getting a hold on the secondary literature. So when you study all these case against theories, which I've looked at all of them in depth, most of them have been abandoned. Most of the critical scholarship right now, as it relates to the resurrection, I've already quoted Gerrit Ludemann. I mean, think about Anthony Flew. Here's Anthony Flew, who you would know, Cameron. The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different, and Flew says, in quality and quantity. And then there's, of course, Ed Sanders, a native Texan from right over here by Grand Prairie, Texas. In his The Picture of Christ book, he said that the Jesus followers, and later Paul, he adds that, and by the way, Ed Sanders was the most famous historical Jesus scholar of the 20th century, had resurrection experiences, is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. So here's the point that I would just follow up on, and with a footnote of your point about probability, is all of critical scholarship seem to agree with the historicity of the resurrection experiences of the early disciples, of those that doubted, and of the opponents of Christianity, but they're not prepared to say what reality that experience was. And so there is almost what I would call a academic apathy now to the resurrection of Jesus, meaning, I'm thinking of Paula Fredrickson, Boston University. I'm thinking of, as I already said, Ed Sanders, Gerrit Ludemann. They're all abandoning the naturalistic theories or naturalistic explanations for just, hey, they had experiences, It really changed their lives. I don't know what they were, and I'm not prepared to make a guess because we can't historically. So that's where they end it. And again, that's where faith comes in. So an aspect of our religion is faith. We can't have certainty. Faith is trusting God through the uncertainty, but it's faith in evidence. But I think it's interesting in my reading, especially of the last 15 years, I can't tell you very many scholars that hold hard to any of these naturalistic theories. It's now gone to what I would call apathy.
So I'm sorry to kind of go back to what I was talking about earlier. Well, it's still all related. So I found the video of the guy that I just recently interviewed. His name is Dr. Joshua Brown, and the title of the video is "Mind Blowing Modern Miracles." Watch this immediately. So we talked about some of his top miracles that he and his team has researched. And there's another guy that I interviewed recently. He's a new apologist, very young guy, probably in his early 20s, but he's currently in the middle of writing a book on miracles, modern miracles. And we surveyed 5 of his top miracles that he's including in his book. His name is Caleb Jackson. The title of that video is "These Modern Miracle Stories Prove Christianity." So very, very interesting stuff. If you're interested in the topic of miracles, how it all relates to the resurrection of Jesus and what we've been talking about, then go check out those videos. So, all right, let's move on. I can't believe we've already been talking for 45 minutes here. Give me your.
Are you serious?
45 minutes. Give me your number 3 reason that Jesus rose from the dead, and then I think you texted me earlier today saying that you've got to include like a fourth. So feel free to share that one too.
I know I might change my mind, Cameron. Okay, so just to again remind people, there's 300 passages in the New Testament on the resurrection of Jesus. There's only 260 chapters. This is something we need to get right. It's understudied. It's underpreached today, unfortunately. Outside of Easter and funerals, we rarely hear about the resurrection today, and so I'm trying to really change that. That's my motivation behind that. And I also this is the shortest book I've ever written, Cameron. Once you get through all the front matter and Gary's foreword, when you just get to the pages that I've written, it's only about 150 pages. So that was probably the hardest thing for me, was to distill. I've published now academically close to 200,000 words in some capacity on some aspect of the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. And something that I was really challenged with this book is writing it where you would have no prerequisites. Like I can hand this to somebody in my youth ministry or at the school and they can pick it right up and understand the nomenclature. So that was a challenge, but I think we did it. But also explaining why it even matters today. So I want to share what I think then is the next one. And notice I've not even gone, this is the third one I'm offering, and I've not even used the scripture yet, which I do explain in the beginning parts of the book. I take the Gospels as historical documents, but there's some great stuff happening in the material culture. Cameron, if I could do it all over again, I'd like to be an archaeologist, because archaeology is Christianity's closest cousin. Again, something that other religious systems cannot say is they don't use archaeology. And so what I write here is written in archaeological sources overwhelmingly, and I use that word, confirm and support the gospel's resurrection narrative. When you look at the juridical procedure of the gospels that's recorded in all 4 gospels, you see that the gospel writers must have known something and been very familiar with Jewish burial traditions. And in the relatively young science of archaeology, it's only about 150 years old as a discipline, we see in the land of Israel that burial was a sacred duty of Jewish families. There's around 150,000 Jewish families that are buried right now. Am I still on? I'm still okay. Good. There's 150,000 Jewish. Okay, great. Thank you so much. 150,000 bodies buried on the Mount of Olives alone. When you go and you see those bone boxes, if you've been to the land of Israel, you can Google pictures of it. You'll see that burial was a sacred duty in Judaism. And then we have the incredible discovery from 1967 of Yehohanan. How do I know his name? His name's written on his bone box. That's the long form of John. And remember, in Jewish burial traditions, you had to be buried before nightfall. And so poor Yehohanan, they really nailed him good, quite literally, in his heel bone. And you see there's a 4.5-inch crucifixion spike that had fish hooked inside his heel bone. He had to be buried before nightfall. And so they just ended up burying him, Cameron, crucifixion nail and all, right in with the tomb. That tomb then, his bones are collected in a process called oscillation, second burial, on the anniversary of death. He's not buried honorably. Let me be very clear. He's buried properly. And then his bones, even though he's a crucified criminal, crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate in the 20s AD. Pilate's, of course, governor, prefect, 26 to 36, later died by suicide. Yehohanan was still buried as a crucifixion victim. And so this flies in the face of some of the popular critical scholarship like John Dominic Crossan, who said that Jesus's body wasn't buried. It was rather eaten by dogs or stray animals. And Jody Magnus, who I quote in my book, Body of Proof, she's I think an atheist or agnostic archaeologist at the University of North Carolina. She makes a fascinating statement. According to her work on archaeology, and again, she doesn't have a theological motivation to say this, when you look at the juridical procedure and the gospel narratives related to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, guess what she said? The Gospels get it right. And so those are the three arguments that I would lean into really hard. No psychological motivation. If we did invent the resurrection, we did a terrible job. We should have done a better job. And then when you look at the material culture, what's happening right now in archaeology, there's some fascinating things. I have a whole chapter, Cameron. It's only about 2,600 words, but I wanted to update the readers on the fascinating reconstruction project that happened at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The sides of the edicule are actually rock-hewn. They're still intact from the first century. All of it is first century. It's fascinating when you look at the historicity. And, again, not a Christian publication. National Geographic was there covering it all. And, of course, the group from Athens that tested it. So there's some fascinating archaeology around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as well that I probably don't have time to get into, but I do offer it in the book.
Yeah, let me point people to the book one more time. So we've only talked about three of the arguments that are in Body of Proof, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston's latest book. And we did that on purpose. I want you to actually buy the book and check out all the different reasons that he offers for the resurrection of Jesus. But you mentioned Yehohanan earlier, and I wanted to just share a little bit of my thoughts on that story. What I think it does actually is put a nail in the coffin, no pun intended, on the swoon theory. So yeah. The swoon theory, very popular among the Muslim community for various reasons. But this theory says basically that Jesus, he got out of the grave. He was still alive somehow. There's different theories on how he was still alive. Some people think that there was like a medical professional at the time that went in and helped him like heal up, and then he went out and he convinced the followers that he was still alive. And so what I think Yehohanan shows us is just the severity of crucifixion. The nail is still in the heel bone. Imagine having a nail driven through the bone of your heel and then trying to walk around and convince people that you're the risen Lord. It doesn't make any sense. And anyways, feel free to share any thoughts on that. But also, you mentioned that you had a fourth reason. Did you not want to go into that?
Yeah, I want. If we want to take questions, I was more than willing. I will say this too. This isn't one of my seven, but I was contacted by a New York Times obituary reporter by the name of Sam Roberts. And I was contacted, Bart Ehrman, scholars from across the theological spectrum who are all Bible scholars. And I actually got his approval and permission, both from him as the author and from Vanity Fair. They actually wrote, he wanted to know, do we have enough information for me to even venture an attempt at writing an obituary for Jesus? And he did a great job, Cameron. He interviewed me and several other scholars. So he got a lot of different opinions, but I was really pleased. And little did I know it would be published in Vanity Fair. But the cool thing is that entire obituary is also in my book because I got their approval to include it. So the book actually begins with Jesus's obituary. And I also included his emails to me because, again, I'm a historian. I'm not privileging the New Testament or the Bible. I'm looking at it like I would any other historical text. And when he writes to me and says, do we know enough about this Jesus of Nazareth guy to even try to write an accurate obituary of how it would appear in the New York Times today. And he must have been convinced there was. And so again, the reporter Sam Roberts, it's Obituary of Jesus, and he did a really cool job. Just another cool detail that we put in the book that's a little fun to think about and read. How would Jesus' obituary read in the New York Times today?
That is really cool. Okay, let's do some Q&A. So we've had a couple questions sent in by my favorite atheist or agnostic on the show. His name is Kevin. He goes by non-trad Catholic. So he was Catholic and now he's agnostic. But he sent in a question earlier, and what I'll do is I'll put that one on the screen, but then let you guys know that if you do have a question for Dr. Johnston, then leave it in live chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it as we're going through these questions. We've got maybe another 20, 30 minutes of that we can devote to Q&A, so we'll get to as many questions as we can. So this one is from, as I said, Kevin, and he says, given the agreed upon non-historical nature of the Gospels of Peter, Thomas, Judas, etc., why does Dr. Jeremiah Johnston think that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are historical?
Oh, that is a great question, Kevin. Thank you, because they are hugely different. I always encourage my students to first read the differences that you see between these texts. And Gospel of Peter would be one of the earliest. Actually, a lot of people don't know this. Before the Gospel of Thomas was discovered, a German scholar called the Gospel of Peter the fifth gospel, if you can believe that. Thomas kind of took that place. All you have to do is read them to immediately see the differences. Most of those Gospels are not second century. They're much older, so they're not taken seriously by scholars. I think Richard Bauckham, Peter J. Williams, and other great New Testament scholars have done a wonderful job explaining the verisimilitude that is exhibited in what we call now the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They have a familiarity not only with which verisimilitude, meaning they're very similar to the reality of the first century world. They are familiar with not only the names, the appropriate names, the topography, the geography, the culture. Whereas, like in the Gospel of Peter, this was not a sophisticated author. The Gospel of Peter has Jewish high priests in a graveyard worried that Jesus is going to come alive from the dead. Now, that's something that would never have happened because the Jews were so superstitious. A lot of people don't realize the Jews had their fair share of ghost stories and phantom stories. And so in my historical studies, without a doubt, because they're in the right place, they're the right time, and because they exhibit verisimilitude with the first century world of antiquity, they're taken seriously, just like Josephus. Another reason, Kevin, that I take them seriously is archaeologists do as well. Don't ever take it for granted that if you go to any of the around 150 archaeological digs today in the land of Israel, and most of those are not led by self-identifying Christians, they use 6 sources to make sure they're digging in the right spot. And remember, those only happen in the summer and at Christmas time, because that's when college kids will come at their own expense to volunteer at these dig sites. But you'll see they use 6 works: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and Flavius Josephus. Those are the 6 historical documents that they have with them to make sure that their digs are effective. And so if the archaeologists who are atheist and agnostic take those gospel writings seriously enough to use them in a dig, and they don't take the second century gospels and others because there's nothing historical about them, that's also a compelling reason that I take them historically as well.
Archaeology really is fascinating. My wife and I took a trip there in 2016, I believe, 2017, and it was a really cool experience. I mean, I remember something that you talked about earlier, the what is the slope where everyone is buried? What is that called? Right next to the
Mount of Olives, Kidron Valley.
Mount of Olives,
right in front of the Golden Gate. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. That was just like, it's a little bit weird because what you're looking at is literally a gravesite, right? But as a Christian, you look at this and you're like, what they're doing, what the reason why they buried everyone on this hill was because they're expecting the general resurrection, right? So they're expecting to be risen up right there next to the Temple Mount, and it's just really, really interesting. It's also interesting that you have all of these Jews who were buried and still there, and that also I think lends a little bit of credence to the burial account.
It's kind of funny that I don't dance, Cameron, but I have fun when I lecture. And they're not only buried on the Mount of Olives because of their eschatological beliefs, they're buried in such a way that when Messiah comes in their mind, They don't even have to turn around in the resurrection. So they're literally
Yeah.
buried pointed towards the Golden Gate, where they will just rise up and walk straight ahead. They don't even have to turn around in the resurrection.
The point of the reason why I even brought that up is because it was just a surreal experience to be there as a Christian who you read the Gospels, you read the accounts of Jesus walking in first century Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee and all around in Israel and stuff, but to be there and to actually see it and to see that there are accurate depictions and the fact that they can, even in Old Testament times, King David on the hill right next to this Temple Mount, it's like they're still discovering all these certain things archaeologically, that they're getting these details from the biblical narratives themselves. And it's just really, really cool. I definitely recommend that if you can take a trip out there, I think it's really, really worth it. It's going to open your mind to a lot. So, okay, we've had a couple more questions sent in. This one's from Dylan. It looks like there is an atheist YouTuber. You may not be aware of him. His name is Apologia. Have you heard of him?
I haven't.
Okay. He apparently he did a response video to the video that you did, the interview with Sean McDowell. So this guy Dylan is asking if you were planning on doing a response to Apologia, but maybe he's asking me. I don't know if he's asking me or if he's asking you. I don't plan on doing a response to that, and I very highly doubt that Jeremiah Johnston is planning a response video. It's not response videos. YouTube is not really like you're not a YouTuber, from what I understand.
Right. I'll check it out. Sean had texted me about a different atheist name I'm aware of that had some questions and did a video, but I don't think it was this name. So maybe there's more than one. So I don't know. I'll check it out. We'll see. My time is not my own right now. So we'll see. I'm writing. There's a lot of excitement around this book. So I'm trying to get to all the Cameron Bertuzzi's first, and I want to have these conversations, but I'll definitely check it out. Thanks for bringing it to my attention.
All right, so we're still waiting on some more questions to be sent in. Actually, we do have a bunch that were sent in now. I'm just putting them in my list here. Okay, this one is from Nitty. Would the doctor concede that the first resurrection claims were not preached until the body would have been significantly unidentifiable 50 days later?
The proclamation of Jesus's resurrection would be that first weekend. The Kerygma of that resurrection event is about 6 weeks from the date, according to Jimmy Dunn, who is, again, a great Jesus scholar. So I would concede that the proclamation would begin on that first Sunday morning, which we date to either April 9, AD 30, or April 5, AD 33.
All right.
Good question.
Next one's from Get Thee Down. What do you think of people who have had their bodies burned to ash instead of traditional burial? Mm-hmm. This is kind of a theological question.
Yeah, that's such a good one because like this even comes up. This comes up so often today because cremation is understandably a completely normal, fine way to be buried. So many people have died in fire, died in all kinds of different experiences that cause the body to completely disintegrate, but obviously our body also disintegrates in burial for those that are not cremated. So the same thing happens. What I think is it's totally fine. My grandparents had this same question. Amazing Christian people, married over 60 years. They were super concerned that, if you don't mind me being transparent, that like cremation somehow wasn't biblical, that they had to be buried and interred. No, we believe in the priesthood of the believer. You pray about it. Allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you, but just know in the resurrection, Jesus takes inanimate bodies and makes them physical again. Our souls rise with a physically new body. There's not going to be any part of this body that's in the resurrection. I'm going to have a completely new body, a body that never needs to be upgraded. And I think I coined a new term, Cameron, a body that's undieable, literally undieable, like Jesus's body. So I don't want any aspect of this body. So whether this body is burned, whether this body is just disintegrates, I would never have any. I would really caution people to never try to have some kind of theological hill they die on, claiming that someone couldn't be cremated. That's a very personal decision. And as a New Testament scholar and thinker, I'm a real advocate of the priesthood of the believer. You do what the Lord leads you to do and what's best for your family.
So we have an interesting question sent in by Maverick Christian. He says, best objection against your position, and then what is your rebuttal?
Best objection against which position? Like one of my arguments, or?
Yeah, I mean, you can just, I suppose, pick one. He just said your position, so you can just pick one. You can pick.
Here's what it is. What I'm dealing with right now, honestly, is not the all the naturalistic theories, because they're so unbelievable, honestly. What I'm dealing with now are apathetic critical scholars who believe that the early disciples believed, they saw the resurrected Christ, they just don't care. So they don't disbelieve for historical reasons. They disbelieve either for theological reasons or personal reasons, not related to the historical accounts. You can't disbelieve the resurrection on historical if you make a decision based on probabilities. The historical information leads you to make that decision. But the biggest issue that I deal with is the apathy around it, meaning, yeah, they did, and I believe they did, but I just don't care. And so that's where, again, we have to be so good about having faith conversations with these individuals to explain what stands and what falls with the Christian faith, why it actually is relevant to their life if Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave. And so I think that's the biggest comeback right now in scholarship that, again, we need to deal with. These scholars are now conceding, yep, I believe they did. All the historical information, the best historical information that we have, tells us that these early followers, early doubters, and early objectors had experiences of following and seeing a resurrected Savior. Those experiences changed their life and radically transformed their community, but I wasn't there, so I really don't know what to say. I don't know what the reality was of it. And so that's the biggest comeback that I'm seeing. And if I ever write a sequel, I'm going to dive into that, because that's a conversation that is on a whole nother level of essentially the relevance, what stands and what falls with the resurrection. Why should we care, and why don't we?
That actually reminds me of a similar kind of response that comes up during philosophical conversations with people, where what they'll do is it's not necessarily apathy, but it's more just incredulity. So someone will just like think that what you're saying is just really implausible, but that's literally all that's behind it. Is just like, there's a saying, I forget what philosopher said this, but it goes something like this: I don't know what to say in response to an incredulous stare. Is like someone just staring at you with incredulity. What can you really say to that? It's like, okay, anyways, it just made me think that is like one of the more challenging things to respond to is apathy or just general incredulity about something. Like, how do you convince someone to care? How do you convince someone to actually investigate their incredulity and determine whether or not their seeming is justified or not? It is kind of difficult to do that.
It's huge. And I mean, that's why I actually didn't take that much time to talk about the naturalistic explanations, because so few people hold to them today. And by people, I mean scholars who are published. You know, I took one chapter to explain deceit theories, alternative explanation theories. Of course, the mythicist camp I had to do 2 pages on, which probably was too much. And then, of course, the mass hallucination. I mean, nobody ascribes to those. What I'm seeing is just what we said, this apathy about, okay, well, ho-hum, let's move on with our life. Doesn't really affect me.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to just a couple more questions, and I think we'll close it out. So someone did just ask, actually, it be me is their name. Has Dr. Johnston responded at all to any of the mythicist objections? Believe it or not, mythicism is alive and well on YouTube. Well, maybe that's not too difficult to believe.
Cameron, I want to ask you a question. Let me be the host of Capturing Christianity for a minute. I've always wanted to take this channel over. Why do you think, as a YouTuber, that mythicism is still so popular and as a result, subsequently so influential, especially on like Gen Z, for example?
I think it might be. That's a good question. I'd have to think probably a lot more about it to come to some like kind of definitive conclusion. But I think what it might be coupled with is this sort of I'm trying to think of the right term for it, but a distrust of authorities, especially when you think that authority is biased towards some conclusion. So you're just going to disbelieve that person and then go and find some other authority that you sort of agree with already, and then use that person. So I'm noticing, like, even with my work, my own work, I'm trying to always point people in the direction, because I'm a layman. I'm always trying to point them in the direction of the experts. Like, follow this guy, listen to what this guy has to say, listen to this expert, instead of listening to what me, a YouTuber, a photographer, a layman, like, don't listen to what I have to say. Because even when I put out my own videos, I always have them vetted by philosophers. Like, I'll have a philosopher read the script and provide comments and feedback and point out different bad arguments that I'm making and stuff. So I'm always trying to submit to these authorities that are actual, like, experts on the subject matter. But I suppose if I were to guess, like, what is behind it, it might be a sort of distrust in general of religious authorities, or people who are, say, Christian scholars or Christian New Testament scholars, or even Christian philosophers. They think that they're sort of jaded or biased, and so we can't trust them. And so they'll turn to other people that they think are not as biased, and maybe they'll find someone like Richard Carrier. So reason why I don't think that this, I'm a little bit hesitant to put this hypothesis out there, is because I can't understand how someone could think that a Christian scholar is biased, but then read Richard Carrier and think that he's not biased. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
but
I mean, yeah. And I would just add this too. Don't you also wonder, Cameron? I mean, it's alarming to me how few books people actually read, how people are reading fewer and fewer books. So people are just more moronic when it comes to history. They don't know history. They don't know when World War I was, when World War II was. They don't understand the thought patterns that influence governments and universities. And so, you know, when you tell them something like Arian and Plutarch are the only two sources we have for Alexander the Great, and they write 400 years after Alexander the Great, what we have with Jesus, Bart Ehrman, he calls them, what does he call them? And Bart Ehrman calls the mythicists howlers. That's what he calls them in his book. He takes 20 pages and rips them apart, and did Jesus really exist, in his book. And he calls them howlers because they're just laughable. I mean, you can't, if you don't believe in Jesus of history, don't believe in the Roman Empire. I mean, that, and I say something a little bit similar in my book, that, you know, when we look at the evidence, there's 11 sources for Jesus within 100 years of his life. 11. The only competitor to that would be Roman emperors. So I have to appeal to Roman emperors for the same quantity and quality of evidential lines that I have for Jesus of Nazareth. And yet you go on YouTube, and like you said, that's a fact. I'm not going to forget you said that. Mythicism is alive and well on YouTube. And so I just think there's like a real misunderstanding. You probably should do some shows on, and you probably already have, knowing you, just what history is, how we do history, and how we learn from the past to make decisions that influence us today.
Yeah, I wish that... I'm thinking more about your question and like what is it really behind it. I think it does kind of go back to this idea that there's a general distrust of authorities, and so what you do when you're distrusting authorities, what are you going to do? You still got to do some research. So you're going to go on Google, and you can find an argument for any position that you want.
Yep.
Any position. You can go read someone who has a blog who is writing on this, debunking different arguments from scholars, or watching, it doesn't have to be a blog, it can be YouTube. We're on YouTube right now. But that's why I think it's important to actually take the expert opinions seriously, right, and then do the hard work of weighing that. I'm not saying that you're going to be completely irrational if you come on the side of like, okay, I disagree with this scholar, I disagree with this scholar, but the point is to read the scholarship, and I think that's probably what's missing in a lot of the mythicism. There's a reason why mythicism is not taken seriously in the scholarly community. There's got to be a reason for it, and so you got.
Well, and I'm concerned too, like you're so gifted with AI, how pictures can be manipulated today, how I'm concerned about the truth curators. Anytime you have people that curate truth, they insert their own truth. I've done an article or two on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And if you read that, you'll see exactly what I mean, because it doesn't really reflect reality with some of these searches. When you go searching some of these questions, that's definitely a curated answer. And so, I mean, I'm concerned. And Cameron, I think that you give a great challenge to us in your answer, that we've got to read authorities on these issues. Like, I've given my life the last 20 years to study this issue. I've read everything there is to read related to the resurrection of Jesus. I've read more stuff related to critical inquiry related to the resurrection than those that support it, because there's just more critical scholarship related to it. So I'm conversant in it. So you need to find people that give their lives on these, just like you go to a specialist when you have a physical problem. You need specialists in these areas when it comes. There's no difference when it comes to belief systems.
Exactly. But people just tend to think, I mean, that's one of the biggest problems with, I think, religious belief, and the reason why it's dying is because there is such this distrust of authorities, when really what you could do is you could go read a good Christian philosopher and learn what the arguments are for God's existence, say. Right. And people aren't doing that because they think that it's a very personal thing. It's you can just kind of like feel your way through it and stuff. But and not to I think seemings and intuitions and all of that is all very philosophically important, but you need to sort of balance it out. You need to do you need to study the arguments. You need to look at what critics are saying
Right.
in response to the argument. Like you say, you've read all these critics. I feel like we could go on forever, but let's change now to we had a super chat sent in by Nate. So let's get to this one, and this may be the last one that we do, and then close out the show. So from Nate, what are we to do with the 500 eyewitnesses accounts that are just hearsay accounts from Paul? Cameron, I love your videos. You mentioned AI before you respond to this. I actually had AI in the thumbnail of this video. I had AI. Let me see if I can pull it up on the screen. I should be able to pull it up, the full picture here. But I had AI create an image of Jesus in talking to 500 people at the Sea of Galilee. And so I wanted to let me see if I can pull it up real quick. I mean, it's on the thumbnail. I probably don't even need to pull this up, but I'm a little bit proud of it. So let's see if I can find it here. Jeremiah, you can actually go ahead and respond to the question while I'm trying to find this one.
Okay. Thank you for asking this. So the question is the way it was posed, the hearsay related to the 500. And I want to just remind you of the source of the 500. That's Saul of Tarsus. That's 1 Corinthians 15. That's an uncontested epistle of Paul. What do I mean by uncontested? Well, the pastorals are contested epistles. Some scholars say Paul didn't write them. But 1 Corinthians and Galatians, the two primary texts that Paul gets his resurrection tradition from, remember he says, I'm giving to you what was given to me. Wow, look at that picture. It's amazing AI made that.
Yeah, both of those. I showed two images. Sorry to cut you off, but two of those images. It's just crazy what AI is capable of these days.
Created by AI. That's amazing.
Yeah,
wow.
It's not a movie.
And so here's, again, for me, I wouldn't call it hearsay because of the source. Paul, who's taken more seriously in that chapter, is more respected by scholars. And I don't mean just like confessing scholars. I mean, anyone who studies the Bible terminally takes 1 Corinthians 15 at face value. And so that's the source of the 500. The thing that's fascinating to me, though, I would just add this, like if you and I, whoever asked this question, were having coffee together, I would just say, okay, why does Paul not list the women as witnesses? Don't you find that interesting? When he gets into his appearance tradition after verse 4, so verses 5 through 8, he gives this amazing list of appearances. He never once mentions the women, which I just think is fascinating. So I haven't done enough work in that right now to write a chapter on it. But again, if I do a sequel, I'm definitely going to dive into why did Paul not mention the women? That's more the question I have. I take at face value the 500 because Paul says you can go talk to them today. Most of them are alive, though some have fallen asleep. Again, that's sleep in Jesus, koimao. I mentioned that earlier. But I'm fascinated why all four Gospels mention female witnesses of the empty tomb or appearance tradition. Why does Paul omit that entirely?
Yeah, I think that I've done a lot of thinking on. There's a debate that I hosted a couple years ago between Mike Winger and Matt Dillahunty, and one of the things that Matt Dillahunty, if you're unfamiliar with Matt, he's a skeptic, and one of the things he said was that claims are not evidence. And I think that the general kind of sentiment is expressed here, like what you have in Paul's writings is you have a claim of an appearance to 500 people. But I think, I mean, this is a very simplistic way of understanding how evidence works and everything. Like what we have in the Gospels, what we have in Paul's writings, we have testimony. So you can call them claims if you want, but oftentimes testimony is all that we have to go on. It's not just history that we have testimony in. Think about virtually any scientific fact that you know, or you think you know. What is it based on? Probably the testimony of some teacher that taught it to you, the testimony of some scientist writing in a textbook. You've got to, like, if you've read a scientific paper on some topic, you're relying on the testimony of the scientist to accurately give you the results from their experiments. And so you're constantly, just in general, the point of talking about science is that it's a sort of generalized problem. We're constantly relying on the testimony of others in our belief formation, just in everyday life. And so, but what we have in the case of Paul is we have testimony. And so what do we do with that testimony is the question. And one of the things that you said is that, and even Richard Swinburne has made the same point, like if you just read Paul, you can see that this is a pretty trustworthy guy. Like he seems like a very honest person. And so he could be honestly mistaken. But then why put in the comment about like, go talk to the people for yourselves?
Yeah,
it's just,
go
it's
check
very,
it out.
Yeah, go check it out for yourself. It's just a very difficult to, if people do it. I mean, people hand wave evidence away all the time, but I can't do that. So,
But also though, like I'm friends with judges. Like we have an awesome friend here who's a judge. I mean, they use eyewitness testimony all the time in adjudicating cases. And so, some of these critical lines, they don't really work in the real world. They just work when we talk about religion. And the thing that I think is fascinating too is just when you look at not only the experience of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, but Galatians chapter 1. Galatians 1, Paul goes to Jerusalem right after his Arabia experience. He meets with James, by the way. That's probably where he heard about Jesus' appearance to James. He meets with Peter. Then he goes up and he meets with them again, and Peter, James, and John are there. So you have the four key guys, and they spend 15 days together. So even though, and this is another word to us about the importance of church and community, even though Paul experienced the resurrected Christ, he still went to check it out. Literally, it's hystereo in Greek in Galatians 1. He went to check out the gospel, and he meets with the earliest sources. He meets with Peter and with James. And so Galatians is another uncontested book. And I just find that timeline compelling when you look at those two passages together, Galatians 1 and 2, and then 1 Corinthians 15.
All right, one last question. I know I said that we already had the last one, but we have a couple more minutes, so we might as well get to it. So Nate has actually sent in another question. He says, biases and subjectivity in research. What are your thoughts?
Everyone has them. Everyone has bias and subjectivity. It would be intellectually dishonest to say that there wasn't a bias. But I can tell you in my program, they beat that out of me so hard. You wouldn't know where I was coming from if you didn't know me, if you read my academic monograph. So I think that we do a really good job of acknowledging we see the bias. But again, at least in my training, that's why I was taken off guard so much. 3 years at, first at Research Induction School, then 3 years in Oxford, them telling me, we don't give a care what you believe, Jeremiah, just work your argument, carry out your argument. And then the ironic thing is when William Telford, who examined me, he was a student of the great William Barclay, by the way. Telford, the very first question of my viva says, do you actually believe the resurrection of Jesus happened, or is that just imaginative storytelling? So here for 3 years, Cameron, I've been told, we don't care what you believe. Don't acknowledge any bias. Give your opponent's perspective even more clear than your own, or as clear as your own. And then the first question I'm asked in my viva is what I believe. It's like I can't. How do I reconcile this? So that's a kind of an interesting thing related to bias and subjectivity in research. Again, everybody's biased, but you know what? We all make decisions with a risk assessment, don't we? And this is what I would just say. No matter what you do in life, no matter what decision you make, every single day you're making probability-based decisions. And so we make those all kinds of different ways every day. And so when I look at, when do we know enough information to give our hearts to Christ? And I know enough information, and I will tell you my bias. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. I believe with all my heart Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave. And that's why game, set, match for me. That's why I'm a follower of Jesus, is because of the fact of the resurrection.
What do you think about this? So I've done several videos at this point with different philosophers on all sorts of different arguments. And this is not necessarily an argument, but it is something that gets brought up quite often, especially in the popular culture, is something called Pascal's wager. Okay, and there's a lot of responses. If you search for Pascal's wager debunked or whatever on YouTube, you're going to find a lot of videos with sort of basic objections to Pascal's wager. And a lot of people watching these videos think that, okay, Pascal's wager is now done and debunked. But there are contemporary philosophers, even agnostics, that are working on this and responding to different objections, formulating different versions of Pascal's wager. There's one that I kind of wanted to run by you and get your thoughts on it. So it comes from a lady called Liz Jackson. I think she got married a couple years ago. So she's her name, I can't remember her last name, but most well known as Liz Jackson. But she's got a version of Pascal's wager where she basically argues that you should commit yourself to the religion that you think is most likely true. So that's basically the idea. And it undermines a lot of these sort of different multiple religions objections. And but what she argues is that because of the decision matrix that's involved and the potential utility for accepting the religion and potential utility for rejecting the religion, atheism is rendered sort of irrational, actually. And so at least pragmatically irrational. And so I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that. As for someone who is kind of struggling with whether or not to commit to Christianity, you might still be on the sort of fence about it. But what this might do for you, this Pascalian type wager, is if you do think of the religions that you've currently surveyed, of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, whatever, Judaism, if you think that Christianity has the most going for it, which I think Apologetics has actually done a really good job of at least showing that between the different religions, Christianity is probably the most likely, then that may be enough to completely commit your life to Jesus and to Christianity. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that before we close out.
Yeah, I mean, if I don't believe in God, I'm not going to see him anywhere. If I do believe in him, I'm going to see him everywhere. And by the way, I love Pascal. He died at age 39. It was a real loss because he was a scientist, mathematician. A lot of his work was published after his death in a work called Pensées, just mean thoughts in French. He has a great quote, by the way, that I use all the time, that we need to present the gospel in a way that people want it to be true, and then show them that it is. So that always challenges me, that when I have faith conversations, am I doing this as a bulldozer, or am I actually casting the vision of Christianity, the biblical vision, where people are like, man, I may be an atheist, but man, I'd like for that to be true. So Pascal is helpful in more ways than one. Pascal's argument means, make the best decision with the probabilities, and let's say none of it's true, you're no worse off because of it. I mean, that's the layman's interpretation of it for you. What I would encourage you to look at as a parting word is Christianity has the most explanatory power. Christianity makes sense of the world around us. Atheism does not. Even if I didn't believe in Christianity, there's not enough evidence for me to believe in atheism, if that makes sense. When I look at the world around me, the fine-tuning, the design, when I look at, as a father, my children, when I look at something out of nothing, it's just so amazing to me, the world in which we live. And the problem, of course, of C.S. Lewis, the problem of love, not just the problem of evil. Why does anything good happen? Why do I have an expectation of good? So there's a philosophical component as well. There's an emotional component for me. For me, having studied worldview at a serious level, and not just the Christian worldview, because the Christian worldview also helps us understand the flaws of other worldviews. Christianity makes the most sense of the world for me. It helps me interpret the world around me in a way that's so much more understandable than anything else. and it's a challenging way to live. It's a life full of purpose. And because of the resurrection, I know that my life can be poured out in a God-honoring way. And I'm excited about my life. I'm excited about the hope that I live with. I've been memorizing 1 Peter 1, verse 3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who in his great mercy has invited us into a living hope because of the resurrection of the dead. So we can go right from fact to hope. And that's what's happened in my life. And I would encourage that with everybody who's watching.
Well, Dr. Johnston, I'll call you Jeremiah because you and I are friends.
Please.
Like literally.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's my dad.
I've actually, believe it or not, I've had some guests on the show that are like, call me doctor. I'm like, okay, I'll call you doctor.
Yeah, please don't call me that.
Okay. Well, no, it's been great to connect again. I feel like we need to hang out. I'll actually be in Dallas sometime soon. I'm planning on going. There's a huge sort of debate conference, like a 1-day conference of all these different debates that are happening in Dallas on April 22nd.
Cool.
And so I'll actually be in the area. I don't know if you'll be in Dallas during that time, but I'd love to try to connect with you while I'm up there.
Same. I'd love to have you show you around up here. I'll give you some Tex-Mex that'll roll the socks up and down your legs better than.
Well, I live in. Dude, no, it's not possible. It's not possible. The Mexican food is like my next to my wife. Well, and God, I suppose. Is my like number one love.
You have a refined palate. Well, we can test
Mexican
it out up here.
Food. Yeah. All right, Jeremiah. Well, it was great to connect again. Thanks for the show. Point people back to the book. Get Body of Proof. I got it linked in the description for you guys. I should have mentioned that earlier. But he's got some other books, some other great books. Unbelievable is one of the most popular ones. So highly recommend checking out his other works. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity video very soon. See you guys later.
Thank you.
Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?